member of the Information Society? That's a difficult question because I didn't know we were in the Information Society.
So back again at the PPO, fired a few different events and several different bullets, but the highlight for me was definitely the main event, which was a 2.7k buy-in and started you off with 50k in chips, roughly double what you expect in most other events. Now the blinds were also on a 30-minute level structure, so definitely a lot more play than the 300-ish buy-in events, but you also expect a somewhat higher caliber player in these bigger buy-in fields. So right away, kind of came in a little bit late just because of traffic, like 20 or 30 minutes late, and got involved right away. So with a 50k starting stack and blinds at 100, 200, the hijack opens to 400, and I'm in the small blind with queen jack offsuit, and I make the call. The big blind comes along as well, so we're going three ways to flop, which is 993 rainbow. Checks to me. I check, the big blind checks as well, and surprisingly, the original opener also checks. So we still go three ways to a turn, which is a jack. So I pick up a pair, but it's going to be pretty hard for me to get value, I think, from worse, so I just check, and it checks around yet again. The river is now another jack, so the hand just keeps getting better for me. I end up making a boat, so I just bet small, 500, to try to maybe get called by ace high. If anyone's playing a 9 super weird, I don't think they're going away. So I bet 500, the big blind folds, and the hijack, who was the original opener, snap calls. I obviously gladly turn my hand over, expecting it to always be good or a chop, but he shows me pocket nines? What? Yeah, so I totally get checking back the flop in his shoes. I totally get checking back the turn, at least sometimes, in his shoes. But the river is just shocking. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. In fact, the dealer tried to call for a floor supervisor to call a penalty on this guy because he was thinking in his head like, oh, he has the nuts, right? And it doesn't really make any sense for me to have a better hand than him here, but he doesn't technically have the nuts. Pocket jacks is the nuts. So he didn't break any rules, and it was just sort of crazy. I mean, I've been friendly with the guy, but I have never had such a favorable, I've never had such a favorable outcome when it comes to having someone else either like check behind or just call with a mega strong hand when I have something that I can easily put more chips in. So even though I lost, a little bit there, about 900 off my stack, I felt like this was pretty much the best outcome for me, and in a way was just super, super lucky. So now with 40k, I've chipped down a little bit more since the last hand. The cutoff, who's an active player, opens up to 525. I'm on the button with ace queen offsuit, and I decide to make it 1500. The big blind, who is a regular, who I have played with a couple of times, makes it 4.6k now. He'd 3-bet me once or twice already today, and I know he's capable of cold 4-betting a little bit light in these positions especially, so when it folds to me, I decide to make the call. But the flop doesn't really bring me anything. It's 8-3 deuce, and when he bets 6k, I just have to let it go. I'm certainly going to have more sets than him in this spot, but I don't think that's enough of a reason to just try to turn ace queen into some sort of suicidal bluff, so just letting it go seems reasonable to me. So we've chipped down from starting all the way down to 35k now, and we are at the 200-400 blind level with a 50 ante in play. I'm in middle position with pocket fours, and I bump it up to 1100. The small blind, who has been pretty loose so far, makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop, which is queen 9-8 two-tone. He checks it to me, and I just decide to check it back, thinking that this is a pretty bad board and a pretty bad hand to c-bet with. The turn is now an ace of clubs, and when he leads for 1600, I'm really thinking that this is a much better card for me than for him, and that he shouldn't really have a ton of ace-x in his range, because a decent amount of it with 3-bet pre. Now, that being said, I still have a pretty bad hand to do anything with, but I just decided that this time I was going to get a little out of line against a loose player who might just kind of take a stab here, might just have a 9, might just have an 8, and be kind of putting out a feeler bet. So I bump it up to 5,600, and he ends up making the call. So all that talk of this board being better for me than him kind of goes out the window once he calls. I know from how he calls, he's just super duper strong, and he might not even call with worse than an ace here ever anyway. However, the river is a 4. He checks it over to me, and I have the best hand here pretty much all the time. He might very occasionally have 8s or 9s and play it this way, but I think even those might choose to 3-bet the turn instead. So I go for a really big bet here of 17.5k, expecting that he is just going to have like a pretty good ace or 2 pair the vast majority of the time. So he almost snaps it off, and I instantly feel bad for not going for more value because he has ace 8 and he didn't even really consider folding. So very fortunate run out here for me. Always nice to get caught bluffing with a basically no equity hand, but then salvage out that tiny bit of equity that you did actually have. So now with 65k, I have pocket aces under the gun, and I bump it up to 1100. Under the gun +1 and the button and the small blind and the big blind all call. So we're looking at a 5-way pot here with aces. Not the ideal, but I guess if I have to play a lot of 5-way pots, I'd rather have aces than not have aces. The flop's queen 4 deuce, two-tone, and I have the ace of both suits. And on this kind of coordinated board, I would often be betting, but I decided to take a little bit of a different line here and just check. I figure I'll be able to get some reasonable value later on, and on the flop, if I do bet into 4 opponents, I pretty much have to have a pretty narrow range that is primarily value. So I don't mind occasionally, mind you, occasionally, not always, occasionally checking a hand like this and then going for my value on a later street. So when the turn is the 6 of hearts and rings the back door, flush draw makes it available, it checks to me, and of course I'm betting now. I bet 4k, and under the gun +1 and the button call. So we are still 3 ways to the river here, which is the 3 of hearts. Obviously a bad card because one of the things I'm hoping to get value from is flush draws, but that being said, I do have the ace of hearts in my hand, which cuts down on the flush draws available. That being said, most of the hearts on the board are small, so there are still some big hearts available. So I check, and unfortunately under the gun +1 bets 10k. The button folds, and I'm in a pretty annoying spot. It seems unlikely that he can have bluffs here, but I just kind of talked myself into a call because honestly I had a really good hand and the way I played it was pretty deceptive. But regardless of how deceptively I played it, the vast majority of the time he's just going to have a flush here, what he's representing. I do call, and he does of course have the king jack of hearts, so we lose a pretty sizable pot here and kind of get punished for taking our unusual line. So let that be a lesson to me, I guess. Just as a quick note, guys, I don't take note of every single hand, so in these times where like I lose a hand but then the next hand I've chipped up, don't be too shocked, don't be angry with me that you didn't get to see every single hand. It's just not practical for me to take down every hand that I play, particularly if I'm running pretty good like I am in this event so far. You just sometimes end up playing too many hands to take note of. So at this time, we are now at the 400-800 level with a 100 ante, and I've got about 75k in my stack. It folds all the way around to the small blind, who completes, and I'm in the big blind with jack-8 offsuit, and I just check here. I don't think I really need to be raising that often from this spot. The flop comes queen 6-4, and the small blind bets 800. I decide to peel, which is pretty much just a float. I do have some backdoor stuff going on, but it's not like my hand has much value. The turn is the 7 of clubs, which is, one of the better cards for me for this exact hand. And when he bets 2300, I think there's a lot of hands in his range that are going to be one pair, a lot of hands that he's just kind of stabbing with. So I decide to actually raise now that I have a little bit of equity to go along with this float. I make it 6,800, and unfortunately he actually calls, which is definitely concerning. Not super excited about it, and I'm usually shutting down by the river. But the river actually gives me the gut shot, brings in the straight with a 5 of hearts, and he now leads for 13k. And I spent a really long time thinking about this hand because I didn't really know if I could raise for value, if that was going to be too thin. I'm obviously never folding, but I thought maybe just calling was going to be right. But in the end, I do raise to 38k. He pretty quickly shoves, and obviously I have to call. He has queen 8, and we just chop. So I was in really horrendous shape all the way through. And like I said, just running really good in this tournament so far. So now sitting with 80k, still at the same blind level, I open an early position with 10-9 of hearts to 2.1k, which is the standard at this point. Middle position in the button both call, and they are both pretty solid regulars. Definitely not excited to see them both call when I have this exact hand. The flop comes 5-5 deuce rainbow, and I do have a backdoor flush draw, and when this board is so low and so dry and I can have the most overpairs, I decide to c-bet to 2.6k. Only the button calls, but middle position accidentally mucks the 10 of diamonds, so pretty bad card for him to muck since that gets rid of one of the overcards I can hit. But the turn is instead the 10 of clubs, so I still managed to hit one. I now decide to check because I don't think I would have a ton of double barrels on this board as bluffs, and I don't mind checking particularly one of the weaker value hands in my range now. The button bets 5.3k, and I of course call. The river is a 4 of hearts, I check again, and the button actually bets 15k now. With his sizing and with the fact that he called and then bet twice, I was a little bit worried about specifically pocket 4s, pocket 5s, and pocket deuces, but I also felt like there was at least a chance that he would bet something like, just pocket 3s now, or pocket 6s through 9s for some very thin value against ace high. So I did end up calling, and he does show me pocket 4s. So felt rather karmic in the sense that I put this, it wasn't the exact same kind of run out, but basically this exact beat on another player earlier. So hard to complain too much about that, but definitely unfortunate that he hits it there on the river, and I think I have to call off. In this next hand, we're at the 600-1200 level with a 200 ante, and I've got 90k in my stack right now. Very, very healthy. I'm under the gun with pocket 5s and open to 2.8k. The cutoff calls, and he is unfortunately a complete unknown at this point. He's recently been transferred to this table, so I don't really know anything about him. The flop comes ace, ace 7, and I bet 2k, and the cutoff, who again is unknown, calls. Now, when someone's unknown, you do kind of have to go with a little bit of stereotyping so far as like age, how serious they look about the tournament, and some of these other sorts of things. So just looking at the guy, he does look like he takes the game seriously. He's young, he's wearing a t-shirt and a hoodie, and he looks pretty serious at the table. So when the turn is a 3 of spades, I'm not necessarily thinking my hand is good, but I think that a double barrel here might work pretty often just because I think on such a dry flop, I might just get floated pretty often. So I go for another bet of 7k this time, and unfortunately, I get raised, and he raises to 21,500. Now, it's very tempting to read too far into these sorts of little stereotypes and try to just basically justify putting in a lot of money in weird spots when you don't know a lot about someone. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty good board for an under the gun open, and I did just double barrel. So seeing him raise, I don't think he's going to have a ton of air, and I think we could pretty safely just let it go. There's also the matter of only being on the turn again, and if we have to face a bet on the river, it's going to be for a very sizable portion of our remaining stack. So I don't think we really need to fight overly hard here. So we're going to let him take that one down. Kind of unfortunate to take a pretty thin barrel spot, a spot I don't always barrel, and then get raised. But that's just how it goes sometimes. At this point, we've now been chipping down for quite a while, and I'm sitting on just 37k at the 1200, 2400 level with a 300 ante. It's getting pretty serious here, and I have a stack that's pretty much just going to be all in soon, and we see Under the Gun open to 5.2k. I'm Under the Gun +1, and thankfully look down at pocket jacks for a pretty easy jam all in. Surprisingly, we see the big blind cold call, and Under the Gun actually folds, and we are up against ace queen. But the board comes out very pretty for us. It's 3-3 deuce, 8 deuce. So never really a threat here. Aside from his overcards, he never really flopped any equity, and we just get the full double up here, along with the open from Under the Gun. So still at the same blind level, but several orbits later, I have 70k, and I'm in early position with ace king. I open it up to 6k, and the hijack jams for 26k. So just a hair over 10 bigs, and obviously I'm calling. He has ace queen, which is, a great spot for me. I mean, awesome shape to potentially have like 40 bigs after this hand. But the board comes jack 7-3, ace, queen. And he actually basically leapt out of his chair when the queen came on the river. And I was pretty calm about it. A lot of times I'm a little salty when these kinds of runouts happen, but I remember feeling very calm about it. And I think it partially comes from realizing how fortunate I'd been in the tournament so far, and from getting some very, fortunate runouts leading up to this point. But it really sucks getting to this point in a tournament pretty late on day one and having the opportunity to have like 40 bigs again, but instead being knocked down to like 20. So sitting with 50k, still at the 1200, 2400 level, a guy who just basically has all the chips opens to 12k in early position. I'm in middle position with pocket 10s and have a pretty easy 3-bet jam. Folds back around to him, and he calls with pocket 9s, which is definitely lucky for us to be called by one of the few hands that I think he's going to have an easy call with that we're still ahead of. And the board comes jack 7-3, 10 on the turn to make things at least a little more interesting. He's got, 4 outs now instead of 2 because he can hit the gut shot with an 8. But the river is a 9, giving him a set just a little too late. And we get another double up here to just barely breach 100k for the first time. So now up another blind level, 1500, 3k, and the ante is 400. I've got 95k in my stack, and the cutoff opens to 7k. Don't know a lot about him, but again, just judging by his looks and what I've seen so far, he's going to be pretty active and has a lot of chips at the table, so he most likely got them from being pretty active as well. It folds to me in the big blind, and I also have a very defendable hand with queen jack, so I make the call. And the flop comes down queen jack 5, so way above average for this hand and for this action against, just a cutoff open. I check, and he bets 7k to continue. I definitely have an option here between calling and raising. I think raising would be reasonable, but I'd be much more likely to do it if there was a flush draw on board, or maybe if the 5 was something a little more coordinated, like an 8, a 9, something like that. I just don't have a lot of bluffs when the board is exactly what it is, so I choose to just call instead. The turn is now the 8 of spades, which does bring in a backdoor flush draw possibility, and obviously also completes 10-9, but that's about it. I check, and when he checks it behind, it's pretty unlikely he has those kinds of hands. I think that most of the flush draws would be double barreling, and 10-9 would be barreling as well, since, it's reasonably likely that I have a queen here a decent amount of the time. The river is another 8, which pairs the board and bricks the flush draw. I bet 17k, basically trying to target some of his jack X, maybe very occasionally get called by ace high if he just thinks I was floating the flop. But he kind of confuses me by raising to 50k. It is a very big portion of my remaining stack, and it's definitely relevant at this stage in the day because, we're starting to get to the point where it's pretty likely I could bag if I, hold on to my chips, basically. That being said, I do have a lot going on for me in this hand. I mean, I have top 2, so there's no other 2-pair hand that can beat me, except for King's Plus, which I think is usually barreling turn. it's also not super likely that he has backed into trip eights, because he would have to have an 8x hand where he c-bets, decides to just take his equity on the turn instead of barreling his equity on the turn, and then he'd have to, hit this river. So since I already kind of eliminated 10-9, I block queens and jacks, and I think those are unlikely to bet flop check turn anyway. I decide to call. But he shows me the bad news with the 8-6 of hearts. And this was a frustrating one. This was probably the hand I was the most frustrated by during the day. And, I don't know if I could have folded there. I think if I knew more about the player, maybe I could have found a fold. Maybe I could have played the hand a little bit differently on the flop. But ultimately, with the given information, I just didn't see how I was going to get away. So that hand took a very large chunk out of my stack, left with just 34k, so just about 11 bigs. I have pocket kings versus an early position limp, so very easy jam in middle position. I can't really do much else. I don't see a lot of value in like over limping or like making it super small or something like that. So I'm all in, and we actually end up getting called by the big blind. Well, I think he maybe rejams over the top, but he's in there with us with the pocket eights. The flop comes Jack 10-9, which is interesting, but the turn's a queen, giving him a straight. But it also gives me a straight. And before I could even figure this out, the ace of clubs hits the river, and I've won the hand. And it was one of those spots where I was just like a little bit in a daze, because I couldn't figure out right away that like the queen wasn't actually a good card for him. So very fortunate pickup there, particularly since we got so short to get such an easy jam with kings and get some action as well. So in the last level of the night now, 2k, 4k with a 500 ante, chipped back up a bit here even since doubling to 86k. So, reasonably healthy with about 21-ish bigs, but definitely have some work to do if we're going to make day 2 and continue on from there. So the guy from the 8-6 of hearts hand opens in middle position to 9k with about 250k behind. I have king jack offsuit on the button, and I have a pretty interesting decision. I think you could almost go any direction with this. You could certainly fold and it would be reasonable. You could jam, and I don't think that's crazy based on what we know about the guy and how active he's been. But I also think flatting's okay because his range is going to be kind of wide. This hand plays okay and, will perform well against his range. The only kind of downside I think to calling is that when the big blind calls, we have to go 3 ways. And the big blind does, in fact, call with 200k behind. However, all of those considerations kind of become moot when the flop comes ace queen 10 and we just flop the nuts on a 2-tone board. The big blind checks and the middle position player bets 15k. I have just about 75k at this point in my stack, and it's sort of weird because the sizing that he's made it makes it a little bit awkward to try to raise small, and just calling also allows him to sometimes catch up, or maybe even kill some of my action. So given how bloated the pot is pre-flop 3 ways and with all the antes and stuff, I just decide to jam for 75k. Folds back around to middle position and he tanks for quite a while, but eventually he just can't let go of it. He's got queen 10 of hearts for bottom 2, and I really don't blame him for calling. There's so many draws available, so many combo draws that I would do this with, but in this instance he's in pretty bad shape. The turn is the 9 of spades, which doesn't help him at all, and the river is the 8 of clubs, sealing the deal and letting me get a really big double up right at the end of the day. So I don't remember exactly what I bagged, but I ended up bagging a pretty reasonable stack for day 2, pretty much entirely because of this hand. I think I had right around 40 bigs after it, and it was obviously a very fortunate day for me. I mean, I went over most of the big hands, and you could see just all the stuff that happened was largely fortunate and largely, spots where I didn't necessarily play perfectly, but I did try to attack in some good spots, and I just ended up running into good hands, but then getting luckier than the other guy. And that's kind of what tournament poker is sometimes. It's very easy to, I think, lose sight of that there is so much variance in it. So I've been trying to kind of just embrace the variance not get as hung up on it as I used to, and just kind of enjoying the roller coaster that is tournament poker. So remember, if you like this video, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll be putting out the day 2 video for this tournament soon, and I hope to see you guys there. See you next time.